Hi, I'm Maria. I work at Joe's, a no-frills diner that's more about grease than glamour. Today started like any other, with me tying my apron a bit tighter and hoping for decent tips. The bell above the door jingled mid-morning, and in walked this guy who looked like he had taken a wrong turn on his way to some high-end office. Dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my rent, he took a seat at the counter. "You lost or something?" I asked, wiping my hands on my apron as I approached him. He flashed a quick smile. "Sort of. Heard you serve the best breakfast in town and I'm starving. Got anything that can fix that?" "Well, if it's food you want, you're in the right place," I said, handing him a menu. "Our pancakes could do the job, or are you one of those egg white omelette kinda guys?" He chuckled, and that sound eased the morning chill a bit. "I'll take the pancakes, and add some bacon. Lots of it." "Coming right up," I said, scribbling down his order. As I passed the order to the cook, I couldn't help but steal another glance his way. He seemed out of place yet oddly comfortable sitting among our regulars who didn't bother looking up from their mugs. When his food was ready, I slid the plate in front of him and watched as he dug in like it was his first meal in days. "Not bad, huh?" I remarked. He looked up, a bit of syrup on the side of his mouth. "Not bad at all. This might just become my new favorite spot." "Glad to hear it," I replied. "We could use a few more suits around here, balance out the trucker caps." He laughed, and we got to talking. His name was Jonathan, and he worked in finance, whatever that meant in detail. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. He asked about me, and I kept it simple. "Just keeping things running around here," I said. "So, Maria, what's a girl like you doing in a place like this?" he asked with a grin that told me he wasn't just talking about the diner. I raised an eyebrow. "Trying to make a living in this crazy world." "What's a guy like you doing, dropping into diners that look like a stiff breeze could knock him over?" "I like to keep things interesting," Jonathan replied, his eyes twinkling a bit. "And I guess today, that meant finding the best pancakes in town." We continued chatting as he ate. He didn't put on airs or try to impress me with his obviously well-off life. Instead, he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say, which was more than I could say for most. As he was about to leave, he turned back to me. "So, Maria, can I come back tomorrow? Maybe try the omelette this time?" I smiled, wiping down the counter. "Sure thing, Jonathan. We're here all day, every day. Just don't wear out your welcome too fast." He laughed, that easy sound again. "I'll try not to. See you tomorrow, Maria." And just like that, he walked out, leaving a nice tip and a curious warmth in his wake. Little did I know, this suit would change my life, not just my tip jar. True to his word, Jonathan was back the next day. And the day after that. It wasn't long before he was part of the furniture at Joe's, his fancy suits a stark contrast against the backdrop of worn-out booths and faded wallpaper. Each morning, he'd take his usual spot at the counter, and I'd serve him his breakfast with a side of banter. "Maria, you ever think about escaping this joint?" he'd ask, sipping his coffee as he eyed the usual morning rush. "Escape? And miss all this?" I'd gesture around at the chaos of the morning rush. "Where else would I get the pleasure of your company?" He'd laugh, that rich, warm sound filling up the space between us. "Fair point. But seriously, you could do anything. Ever thought about what else is out there?" "I don't know, I guess I'm just comfortable, you know?" I admitted one day, refilling his cup. "Sure, it's not glamorous, but it's familiar. It's home." Our banter became the highlight of my mornings. But it wasn't just jokes and light talk. Sometimes, when the diner was quiet, and the world outside hadn't yet ramped up to full speed, Jonathan would share bits and pieces of his life outside of those suits. And in those moments, I felt a connection that went beyond server and customer. "You know, my family's not too keen on where I spend my mornings," he confessed one quieter day. "They can't understand why I'd prefer Joe's pancakes over some five-star breakfast menu." "And what do you tell them?" I asked, genuinely curious about his reply. I tell them they don't know what they're missing, he said with a smirk. That and I've got a good reason to stick around. The implication hung in the air, unsaid but understood. I'd be lying if I said it didn't give me butterflies. But life has a way of reminding you not to get too carried away. So, I brushed off the fluttering in my stomach and kept things light. Keep talking like that, and I might start charging you extra for the charm, I warned him with a mock stern look. Charge away. He laughed. It'd be worth every penny. His visits became the parts of my day I looked forward to the most. It wasn't just that he was easy on the eyes or that his tips were more than generous. It was the way he looked at me like I was someone worth seeing. Like I was more than just a waitress in a tired diner. But as easy as it was to fall into a routine of smiles and subtle flirtations, I knew life wasn't a fairy tale. Guys like Jonathan didn't end up with girls like me. Or so I thought, until the day he proved me wrong. Maria, what do you say we take this conversation somewhere else tonight? Dinner, my treat, somewhere without greasy spoons and coffee stains. I paused, the offer hanging between us. It was one thing to flirt across a diner counter, quite another to step out into the real world together. But looking into his earnest eyes, I decided maybe, just maybe, it was worth the leap. Dinner outside of Joe's turned into more dinners and then into movies, walks, and whole weekends together. Jonathan and I, we just clicked like I never thought possible with anyone, let alone someone like him. It was a chilly evening in November when everything changed again. We were at this little overlook in the city, one of those spots tourists don't know about but locals treasure, watching the lights blink on across the skyline. Maria, you know you mean the world to me, right? Jonathan started, his breath misting in the cold air. I chuckled, tucking my hands into the pockets of my coat. I'd hope so by now, considering how much of your wardrobe has taken over my apartment. He laughed, that sound I'd come to love. But then he turned serious, taking my hands in his. I'm not just talking about leaving a few shirts around. I mean, I want us to start thinking about a future together. He pulled a small box from his coat pocket, flipping it open to reveal a ring that caught the city lights just right. Will you marry me, Maria? Joy, pure and simple, rushed through me. Yes. I almost shouted it, then laughed at my own eagerness. Yes, I'll marry you. We kissed there, under the starry sky, the city sprawling out below us. It felt like a scene from a movie, only it was real, and it was ours. But reality has a way of creeping in, doesn't it? On the way back to my place, I had to voice the nagging concern that had been eating at me since he slipped the ring on my finger. Jonathan, you know I'm not exactly what your family might have pictured for you, right? I mean, my most expensive dress is from the discount rack at Macy's. He squeezed my hand, his smile reassuring. I love you for who you are, Maria, not for what you wear or where you come from. My family's cool, they'll see what I see. The first hint that things might not go as smoothly as Jonathan believed came a few weeks later when we went to dinner at his parents' house. His dad, George, was a big, hearty man who greeted me with a loud welcome and a bear hug that lifted me off my feet. His grandmother, a sharp-eyed lady with a surprisingly warm smile, patted my hand and told me to call her Mrs. Anderson. But Eleanor, Jonathan's mom, she was another story. She had this way of looking you over like she was evaluating every piece of you. So, Maria, what do your parents do? She pressed, her eyes narrowing just a bit. I knew where this was heading, but I wasn't about to lie. My dad's a mechanic, and my mom's a cashier at the grocery store. We're not fancy, but we get by. Every time I walked into Jonathan's family home, it felt like stepping into a different world, one where every glance and word was weighed and measured. His dad, George, and his grandmother, Mrs. Anderson, always treated me with kindness, which made what I had to endure from Eleanor, Jonathan's mom, even harder to swallow. Dinner was a fancy affair, as always. George and Mrs. Anderson were warm and welcoming, asking me about my day with genuine interest. But Eleanor had a different agenda. As we settled around the dining table loaded with more types of forks than I knew what to do with, she started her usual interrogation. "So, Maria, was food scarce in your house as a child?" Eleanor asked, her voice dripping with a fake concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "We always had enough, Mrs. Hunter," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "My parents made sure of it." "And the cutlery," she continued, eyeing me like I was some specimen under a microscope. "Do you find our silverware confusing?" I glanced down at the array of shining metal by my plate and then met her gaze squarely. "No, ma'am. A fork's a fork. It's all about getting the food to your mouth, right?" There was a stifled chuckle from George, quickly silenced with a sharp look from Eleanor. The conversation took a slight turn when I mentioned my job. "I'm managing a cafe right now," I told them. "And I help out as a waitress, too. My dad's been ill, and the extra shifts help cover the medical bills." Mrs. Anderson's eyes softened. "That's very commendable, Maria. It's important to support family. You're doing a wonderful job." Her words were like a warm blanket, but Eleanor quickly stripped it away with her frosty smile. "Indeed, how resourceful of you," she said, her tone suggesting that resourceful was somehow a step down from respectable. As dinner progressed, the air grew tenser. Once we moved to the living room for coffee, Eleanor cornered me while Jonathan was out of the room. "Maria, you do understand that marrying into our family isn't just a personal commitment but a social one too," she began, her voice low and pointed. "There are certain standards one must uphold." Standing my ground, I faced her with as much calm as I could muster. "I know I come from a different background, Mrs. Hunter. But I love your son, and I'm not here to cause trouble or embarrass anyone." "And your family?" she prodded, clearly not ready to let it go. "Will they be comfortable in settings like this? Or will they stick out?" "That's enough, Eleanor," came Mrs. Anderson's sharp voice behind us. Jonathan's grandmother had stepped into the room, her presence commanding. "Maria has shown nothing but grace under your scrutiny. It's more than I can say for others." Eleanor's face tightened, but she held her tongue in front of her mother-in-law. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson," I said, feeling a surge of gratitude for the elderly woman's intervention. Mrs. Anderson nodded, then turned her keen eyes on me. "You're a strong young woman, Maria. It's clear you care deeply for our Jonathan. That's what truly matters." As the wedding day drew closer, the mix of excitement and nerves swirled around me like a whirlwind. Jonathan and I were up to our elbows in planning details, from choosing flowers to finalizing the guest list. We wanted something small and intimate, but even small details felt monumental. One afternoon, buried in brochures and fabric samples, my phone rang. It was Lisa, my maid of honor, checking in. "Hey, girl, how's the wedding factory today?" Lisa's voice was like a lifeline in the sea of decisions. "You mean the chaos factory? We're drowning over here. Can't decide between roses or lilies, and don't even get me started on the tablecloths," I groaned, scanning a catalog. "Go with roses. They're timeless, Maria. But tell me, have you nailed down your dress yet?" Lisa knew how to keep me on track. "Yeah, I picked it up last week. It's simple but beautiful. Nothing over the top," I responded, a small smile breaking through the stress. "You're gonna look stunning, Maria. Remember, it's you he's marrying, not the dress," she reassured me warmly. Jonathan, overhearing the conversation, added his 2 cents. "Absolutely, Maria. You'll be the most beautiful bride." I wanted everything to be perfect, not just for us, but to prove a point to some skeptics, especially Jonathan's mom, Eleanor. Speaking of Eleanor, her digs had been constant. Just last week, she dropped a comment that had me seeing red. "Maria, are you designing your dress yourself, or are you picking one off some clearance rack?" Her words, sharp and unwelcome, had lingered in my mind. "Actually, Eleanor, I found a wonderful dress at a boutique. It's perfect for me," I had replied, keeping my tone neutral, despite wanting to snap back. "And the honeymoon?" Let me guess, a charming little getaway to where? Your family's village, she had said, a smirk playing on her lips. No, we're thinking of a road trip. Just the two of us, exploring some places we've always wanted to see. I had countered, my voice steady but my hands clenching into fists out of sight. Her ability to weave condescension into every question was like an art form, and each jab made me more determined to have the beautiful day we envisioned, her approval be damned. The final days leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity. I stayed over at Lisa's the night before, restless and anxious, running through every detail in my head. Can't sleep? Lisa murmured in the dark, her voice sleepy but concerned. Not a wink. Just going over everything in my mind, worrying about what Eleanor might pull tomorrow. I confessed, my eyes staring at the ceiling. Lisa propped herself up, her silhouette shadowed in the moonlight. Listen, Maria, whatever happens, at the end of the day, you're marrying Jonathan. That's all that matters. Forget the centerpieces, forget the snide remarks, especially from Eleanor. You're right. It's about us, not the show. I sighed, feeling a bit of the weight lift. The wedding day finally arrived, filled with sunshine and smiles, but a knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I couldn't shake off the uneasy feeling, especially when I caught Eleanor's expectant look as I walked down the aisle. Everything about her gaze whispered that she was waiting, maybe even hoping, for something to go wrong. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Jonathan and I exchanged vows, promising to stick by each other through thick and thin, and for a moment, I believed we could overcome anything. But that optimism shattered at the reception. After the initial toasts, where Jonathan's dad and Mrs. Anderson spoke warmly about unity and love, Eleanor stood up to make her speech. There was a gleam in her eye that didn't sit right with me. My heart sank as she took the microphone, her voice ringing out a little too cheerful, a little too loud. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, her tone jovial as if she were about to tell a funny story. Today we welcome Maria into our family. Maria, with her humble origins, which she has so often shared with us. From her stories, we've learned so much about making do with less. The room grew uncomfortably silent. My face heated up, and I felt Jonathan stiffen beside me. Eleanor continued, oblivious or indifferent to the shifting atmosphere. Indeed, Maria has shown us all how from very little, one can reach heights they never dreamed of, almost like a fairy tale. It's just marvelous how someone accustomed to so little could adapt so well to the abundance of our family. Isn't it just a modern Cinderella story? From rags to riches, or should I say, from freeloading to feasting at our tables? The guests murmured, some in shock, others in discomfort. Tears pricked at my eyes, humiliation washing over me in waves. Beside me, I could feel Jonathan's rage through the tight grip he had on his chair. My parents, sitting in the front row, looked down, their faces flushed with shame. It was the most excruciating moment of my life, and I felt utterly small and helpless. But before the whispers could grow, Mrs. Anderson stood up, her presence commanding silence as she approached Eleanor. With a firm hand, she took the microphone from her daughter-in-law. Eleanor, she started, her voice stern and powerful, echoing through the hall. It seems you've forgotten where you yourself came from. Let me remind everyone here. She turned to face the confused guests. Eleanor wasn't born into luxury. She worked in our household, and yes, she was a servant. She got pregnant by my son and married him to herself, and her ascent into this family began not unlike the tales she mocks. The room was dead silent now, every eye fixed on the unfolding drama. Eleanor's beginnings were as modest as Maria's, if not more so. And yet, here she stands, casting stones from a house of glass. I wonder, why the scorn? Why the disdain for someone's humble start? Maria has shown nothing but grace and strength, qualities we should all aspire to. Eleanor's face turned a deep red, her earlier confidence crumbling into embarrassment. Without a word, she left the room, her exit as dramatic as her speech. The day after the wedding, instead of relaxing or reminiscing about the event, Jonathan and I were summoned to Mrs. Anderson's grand home. There was a palpable tension as we walked through the doors, knowing that something significant was about to unfold. Mrs. Anderson gathered the entire family in her large sitting room, where portraits of ancestors looked down on us with stern, silent judgment. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation and, for some, apprehension. As we took our seats, I noticed Eleanor's face was pale, her usual poised demeanor replaced with nervous twitches. Mrs. Anderson didn't waste any time. She stood at the head of the room, her presence commanding as she addressed everyone. "I've called you all here today to discuss matters that cannot be ignored any longer," she began, her voice stern. Yesterday's events at the wedding were disgraceful and not the first instance of Eleanor's inappropriate behavior. She pulled out a sheet of paper, which appeared to be a list, and continued, "Here I have a detailed record of expenses that Eleanor has accrued over the last month alone. The extravagance and carelessness are astonishing." The room was silent, all eyes on the matriarch. George shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes fixed on the floor. Mrs. Anderson looked directly at Eleanor. "As the head of this family and the steward of our family fortune, I can no longer justify the continued financial support that leads to such flagrant misuse. Eleanor, you are cut off from your maintenance funds. If you wish to maintain your lifestyle, you will need to find employment." Eleanor gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "Mother, you can't be serious. I've always managed my allowances as I saw fit." "It's no longer just about how you manage your money, Eleanor. It's about how you manage your relationships and responsibilities," Mrs. Anderson retorted sharply. Turning to her son, Mrs. Anderson asked, "George, do you have anything to add?" George, who had been silent up until now, looked up, his expression hard. "I agree with Mother. This has gone too far, Eleanor. And if things don't change, if you continue this way, I can't see this marriage continuing." Eleanor's face crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks. "George, please, you can't mean that. You wouldn't." "I can, and I will if necessary," George replied, his voice steady but sad. "It's time to take responsibility, Eleanor. After all the chaos of the wedding and its fallout, Jonathan and I finally escaped on our honeymoon. Those weeks away were like a deep breath after a sprint. We roamed cities and beaches, trying to put distance between us and the drama back home. But, like all good things, our honeymoon came to an end, and reality was waiting for us when we returned. Pulling into our driveway, Jonathan looked over at me, a hesitant look on his face. "I got a call from Dad while you were napping on the plane," he started, turning off the car but not moving to get out. "He and Mom, well, they're getting a divorce. It's really happening this time." I reached out, squeezing his hand. "I'm sorry, babe. I know how tough this must be on you." He shrugged, a tired sigh escaping him. "It's been a long time coming. Can't say I didn't see it after what happened. I just wish." His voice trailed off, the weight of what he wanted to say hanging between us. We sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the engine cooling down filling the space. "And Mom?" I finally asked, not sure if I wanted to hear the answer. "She's moved out. Got herself a small place downtown. She's looking for a job now," Jonathan replied, his tone flat. The strained relationship with his mother was taking its toll on him. The next day, life tried to return to some semblance of normal. I went back to work, dealing with the everyday, while Jonathan dealt with his family's upheaval. The evenings were our refuge, where we could shut the door on the world's demands. As days turned into weeks, updates from Jonathan's dad became more sporadic. The divorce was messy, dragging emotions and old resentments into the light. Jonathan stood by his dad, supporting him, while I did my best to support Jonathan. Eleanor tried to reach out once, her voice on the phone sounding small and lost. But Jonathan was firm, his words clear. "Mom, you need to figure out some things on your own. We can talk when you're ready to be honest with yourself and with us." After that call, he was quiet for a long time, staring out the window into the darkening sky. I didn't push him to talk. Instead, I sat beside him, my presence a silent promise of the support I had vowed. Moving forward wasn't just about leaving things behind, but about building something new from the pieces. As we drifted off to sleep, I knew that together, we could build something lasting, something true. Not in spite of the challenges, but because of them,